This is my video about how good floodgates are in every card game. So floodgates, for players who don't know, a floodgate is effectively a card which stops you as the opponent being able to do something. Typically, there are either permanent effects for floodgates, such as Blood Moon or Mystic Mine, and there are also effects which are more colloquially known as stun effects, which also serve as a softer form as a floodgate, such as a silence or as a dimensional shifter, which both have effects which stop your opponent from being able to do something, but only for a single turn, meaning that they only disable your opponent for a limited amount of time. Almost every game will have some sort of effect which stops your opponent from casting spells or activating abilities in some way. These effects help keep extremely powerful decks under control, especially combo decks, which focus a lot on performing many actions in one turn. A card like Rule of Law specifically rules out your opponent's ability to cast more than one spell each turn, massively hindering them if they want to combo off with many cards. Effects like these are oftentimes hated, as for example, Yu-Gi-Oh's Vanity's Emptiness is a super powerful lock piece, stopping your opponent from being able to special summon any monsters after it is activated, commonly hated as it completely disables your ability to do almost anything. A card like Loltheb from Hearthstone or Badoo from Pokemon both have effects which disable your opponent's abilities to use spells or item cards, which can severely hinder your opponent even if it's only temporarily, making these very struggling and powerful cards to play against from the opponent's side. So in this video, I want to answer how good are these type of effects in each of the different card games and what are the most powerful players for each of these card games in terms of floodgate effects. To start with Magic the Gathering, I want to go over this card, Smokestacks, which was the first real deck to implement these stack styled effects. They are called stack effects in Magic because of the card here, Smokestacks. So how good are these stack type abilities in Magic the Gathering? And the answer is that they are very strong. These effects are commonly used to counter very degenerate strategies focused on comboing or only using one type of card. If we look at a card like Stony Silence, it only turns off activated abilities of artifacts, meaning if your opponent is heavily relying on them, this card will severely hamper their strategy. Magic also has a wide range of both harder and softer stacks pieces to help disable your opponent's gameplay. If your opponent is a combo deck, Thalia, Guardian, and Thraben will make their non-creature spells cost one more, certainly a hindrance for them, however, not a card that can be completely ignored because if you combo through Thalia, it won't completely stop you from casting any spells, as opposed to a harder stack piece like Rule of Law, which forces your opponent to only be able to cast one spell per turn, meaning it is insanely hard to combo with a Rule of Law in play unless it is first addressed. But as I said in the intro, stacks pieces aren't always loved. There is definitely an unfair element of stacks that goes on when these cards are played. A lot of prominent stacks pieces cause non-games, such as Stasis or Armageddon. Both of these cards lock you out completely of being able to use lands, which are the core piece that you need to play the game. If your opponent plays a Stasis or an Armageddon against you, it is very unlikely that you are going to be able to do anything to counter it if you do not beat the spell before it is cast. Whilst these super hard lock effects like Stasis and Armageddon can lock almost any deck out of playing the game, there are also more global deck stopping effects which will lock out almost all decks that are focused on a specific strategy depending on the format. A card like Trinisphere or Chalice of the Void are both cards that are very prominent in the Legacy format where most of the cards cost 0 or 1 mana. In this way, cards like Trinisphere and Chalice of the Void both catch out unfair combo decks which chain multiple spells together in one turn, either countering them or making them cost additional mana and being unable to cast them. However, it also has the side effect of hosing a lot of normal decks that simply play a lot of cheap spells and have that be a core part of their strategy. Either way, these cards will blank you, meaning that they both hurt the unfair decks and the fair decks equally. All around, this feels really bad, both to play against as the player who cannot cast anything, but it is also very unsatisfying as the player winning, as you don't really have to do anything anymore to beat your opponent, as they are completely disabled from playing the game at all, turning the game into a real non-game where basically none of the cards that were cast before the lock piece actually end up mattering. Now for Yu-Gi-Oh! Now Yu-Gi-Oh! Has plenty of floodgate effects, like we can see here with Imperial Order. It negates all spell effects on the field once flipped up. Commonly, these are all placed on trap cards as well. These are where you're usually going to see floodgate style effects. So how good are the floodgate cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! The answer is that they are insanely broken. Yu-Gi-Oh! Has floodgate effects since the very dawn of the game. They're as old as the game itself, with a card like Jinzo here turning off all trap cards, very iconic card, and a very floodgatey effect to have. One of the reasons that the floodgates are so broken in Yu-Gi-Oh! Though is that they usually gain massively as the power level of the game has increased over the years. A card like Vanity's Emptiness used to be a specific hate card that you would use to target special summoning strategies. Over the years has become completely untenable as special summoning becomes more and more prevalent to every single deck in the whole game. A card like Mystic Mine, when on release, was more or less just a strategy for stall decks to try to keep your opponent from being able to attack you or activate abilities, can become an even more potent effect as turning off all abilities becomes even more relevant as the cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Become more and more powerful. These are some of the reasons why Yu-Gi-Oh's Floodgates are so broken and so powerful compared to any other card game on the market. This leads to Yu-Gi-Oh's Floodgates never really feeling fair in almost any context. These effects typically shut down entire decks by themselves. If we look at a card like Necro Valley here, it completely disables the effects of cards in graveyards, which can turn off a significant number of decks which rely on that zone. Another glaring issue with a lot of the floodgates in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is how they prevent the oust to their own floodgate. A card like the barrier statues, which would normally be easy to deal with, have an ability which stops special summoning, meaning that if you needed to special summon a monster to attack over the barrier statue, you can simply not do that, as the barrier statue protects itself from abilities that would destroy it. The core issue for floodgates in Yu-Gi-Oh! That I always come back to is that even the more fair feeling floodgate effects tend to not feel good even when they are powerful and feel more fair. A card like Royal Decree negates all other trap cards, which feels pretty fair. As a trap card, you should be able to stop other trap cards. However, this card leads to one or two feeling scenarios. Either you activate the Royal Decree, completely blows out your opponent and feels dominant, or you have Royal Decree, it either doesn't do what you want it to do because your opponent doesn't have the trap card that you need to disable, or it is simply too weak, meaning that you feel bad having it. There's really no place where you can put a trap card like Royal Decree in your game where it feels good for both the player and the opponent. And since they've been around since the very dawn of the game, there have almost always been prevalent floodgate style effects in the card game itself. A card like Abyss Dweller has been in the game since as long as XYZs have been introduced and is effectively always seeing some amount of play somewhere because of the ability to turn off your opponent's graveyard being so prevalent and affecting a deck in almost every single metagame. A card like Abyss Dweller and many other lock style pieces are super prevalent all over the game's lifespan. Now for Hearthstone. So Hearthstone doesn't typically have as many hard style floodgate effects, and typically Hearthstone wants you to be able to play your spells even if they're at a much increased cost. So a card like Cold Feet here, which in other card games may lock your opponent out of minions for a whole turn, simply makes the enemy minions cost 5 more, making them extremely hard to cast as opposed to completely incastable. So how good are these floodgate style effects in Hearthstone? Typically, they tend to be pretty bad and not see a ton of play. If we look at a common card like Curse of Flesh here, which turns your opponent's minions into health costs instead of mana, this is a way to effectively stop your opponent from being able to play cards if they only have a low amount of health. However, this cost is extremely hard to do on a 1-mana Warlock spell, as you probably need to play it in the late game when you've already attacked them for enough damage, so that way their life total is low, and then even at that point, it could still be considered an upside to have your minions cost health instead of mana. A card like Resilience Aura seems like it would be the kind of effect that can easily shut down combo decks on its own, making your opponent's spells cost more. But in a game like Hearthstone, where minions are typically used for combat and are generally what you want to be focusing on during the course of the game for interacting with your opponent, cards like Resilience Aura, Curse of Flesh, Cold Feet don't really have much of a home to fit in to stop your opponent's deck. Sure, they can be useful from time to time, but in the vast majority of the games, these cards simply feel like dead weight. In Hearthstone, you're going to see a lot more of discounting the cost of your own cards rather than increasing the cost of your opponent's cards, as it feels a lot better as the player to get a discount on a card you can play earlier rather than forcing your opponent to wait to play their spells, which is something almost no player wants to do. If you're going to have interaction with your opponent in Hearthstone, it is typically going to be through the aforementioned minion combat, or it's going to be using secrets to interact with your opponent, like Counterspell here, for example, which counters your opponent's spell when they cast it. Because you have no control over how to trigger Counterspell, it makes an interesting decision for your opponent for what to trigger the counterspell with, and as you, the player, you can see interesting interactions with the way the counterspell is used on which specific turn and which way you play it. While most of the examples I used previously are bad, there are some good examples of floodgate effects in Hearthstone, but the problem is, when they're good, they still end up causing problems in the game. A card like Loatheb or Speaker Stomper, which both make your opponent's spells cost a significant amount more to cast, brick entire combo decks that are focused around spells for an entire turn. So even though these are lighter stacks effects, which will still disable normal decks a small amount and have a decent sized body for contesting the board, decks that are built around casting many spells in one turn will be completely nullified by playing a card like this. While those were bad, a card like Celestial Alignment, the original printing made it so that way both you and your opponent had your mana costs set to 0 and had all of the cards which had costs in your deck in hand set to 1, meaning that it not only bricked your deck, but it also bricks your opponent's deck for the rest of the game. But because you're the one playing the Celestial Alignment, you can build your deck in a way so that way the downside is actually an upside for you. Your opponent really has very little options for that, meaning that a lot of the time, if you played Celestial Alignment against your opponent, it would simply result in them losing the game, being unable to cast enough spells to keep up with your druid ramping and powerful druid spells. And the most obvious harped on example of a floodgate which completely bricks your opponent out of the game would definitely be the original printing of Reno Lone Ranger. This effect, only removing enemy minions from the game, is massively toned down from the original 8 mana version of Reno, which stopped your opponent from being able to play minions up to 1 minion for the turn that you've played Reno. Meaning that by playing Reno down, it completely stops any form of counterplay your opponent can do, as they cannot simply build a board to contest whatever you want to do on your turn. This way, Reno is the hardest floodgate that Hearthstone has ever seen, stopping your opponent from playing up to 6 additional minions if they could. This type of effect is very toxic, and the reason why Reno was absolutely butchered and nerfed into the ground, where he cost the maximum amount of mana and doesn't even have the initial lock effect that he had when he was printed. It's interesting to me that in a game like Yu-Gi-Oh, where lock effects are very common and have been seen since the start of the game, they are not afraid to print additional versions of those effects for the future players to play with. However, when you have a game like Hearthstone that hasn't had any of these effects, a card like Reno Lone Ranger coming out and introducing a super powerful effect to the game massively upsets balance and is forced to be nerfed over and over again until ultimately the designers decide that this effect simply can't exist in the game as it is way too strong. And finally now for Pokemon. So Pokemon has plenty of effects that are similar to Floodgates, such as Ironthorn EX's ability to shut off all abilities of your opponent's rule box Pokemon that aren't future Pokemon, such as Ironthorn EX itself. Now my question is, how good are these Floodgate style effects in Pokemon? The answer is that they are huge menaces and very prevalent at all different levels of play. A card like Ironthorn EX or Klefki here with this mischievous lock ability, while sitting in the active zone, can completely disable all of your opponent's abilities, making them stop entire strategies by themselves if your strategy heavily relies on the ability of a basic or rule box Pokemon. These cards, along with other cards such as Mimikyu or Ogerpon Cornerstone Mask EX, are stall staples. Stopping your opponent from being able to do functionally anything is a great way to draw your opponent very slowly out of cards in their deck. The Pokemon Company has to keep these effects very, very hamstringed, as all of these Pokemon can only work when they are in the active slot. Otherwise, disabling your opponent's abilities from any other position would lead to many, many games where if your opponent's deck is focused on EX or V Pokemon or Pokemon with abilities, they would simply not be able to play if you ever drew the Pokemon and were able to place it onto your bench. Even so, these cards still lead to tons of non-games where you set up your Mimikyu or your Cornerstone Ogerpon, and then your opponent simply can't do anything to break through as their deck is completely built around the cards with the effects listed on them. Meaning that if your deck doesn't have a specific out to that card or some way to get around it, you will have no way to win the game and can functionally concede, as you have no way to stop your mill opponent from just sitting on you until you're dead. But the locks I showed previously are pretty specific to different decks that don't have an out for that kind of card. An item lock is a much more generic ability because all decks in Pokemon are reliant on item cards to function. In my opinion, these are the absolute bane of any interactive gameplay you can have with your opponent, as stopping your opponent from using item cards massively hinders any deck in the entire game's setup. A card like Seismitoad EX or the recently released Badoo are super easy to use to pull ahead of your opponent in terms of the setup race. By disabling your opponents to play item cards on as early as the first turn of the game, it means that your opponent will have an extremely hard time setting up while you are completely free to, as these cards only stop your opponent from playing item cards rather than yourself. Whilst these cards are really good in the early game to disable your opponent's initial setup, there are cards like Vileplume's Irritating Pollen ability, which are very good at locking your opponent out of items for the entire game. Vileplume's a little bit harder to set up as a Stage 2 Evolved Pokemon. However, once set up, it is extremely hard for your opponent to ever reset up after you knock out some of their Pokemon, as they can't play any item cards they would ever draw off any of their supporters for the rest of the game. In my opinion, the best designed cards are cards which punish the items that would be locked out by these previous effects without actually physically stopping your opponent from using the item cards to set up their strategy. A card like Garbodor's Trash Avalanche ability was a huge metagame staple, as every deck in Pokemon relies heavily on item cards. However, once Garbodor was released, many decks had to start cutting down on their item card usage because of the fact that the Trash Avalanche attack from Garbodor would simply one-hit KO any Pokemon they put out if they were super focused on item cards. This card, in my opinion, really shows the dichotomy of ways you can design locks in your game. Having a super hard lock like Badoo or Seismitoad really stops your opponent from being able to interact in any meaningful way with the lock. However, softer effects like Garbodor still allow your opponent to use every item card they want. However, it has a large punishment that they will have to get around, meaning that you can build your deck in such a way that you can have ways around Garbodor, or you can simply cut down item cards the same way you would if you were planning on playing against a lot of Badoos, Seismitoads, or Vileplumes in your matches. In conclusion here, I think it's come through in the video, but I think that Floodgates can be super duper annoying for all types of players. The most charitable reading for most different types of Floodgate effects are that they stop unfair gameplay and prevent your opponent from being able to do something that is super powerful and combo focused. A card like Thalia, I think, is a great example of a softer effect that stops combo decks from being able to go off as regularly. However, it doesn't completely hamstring these decks, making them unplayable in the metagame. At worst examples for Floodgates, however, you have a card here like Mystic Mine, which when played down would sometimes force the UE opponent to immediately concede, as there is no way for their deck to get out of the Mystic Mine lock. Making a one card win definitely makes it feel like your games don't really matter if your opponent can just play down one card that completely disables your entire strategy. Even so, I do think these style of lock effects have a place in the design of most games. For example, Loatheb is a super duper strong lock piece that disables many a combo deck. However, even though it was printed back in the early days of Hearthstone, the card can still see play into the later years, as its effect is punishing, but not the maximum amount punishing that you would need to make combo decks unplayable. Oftentimes, I feel that the more maligned parts of hard lock effects or floodgate effects could be prevented if they simply had better card design or better design around the effects that are present. A card like Garbodor's Trash Avalanche attack, while it may not seem like a traditional lock piece, significantly affects the deck building of other decks, effectively forming the same function as a lock piece would without having such a harsh punishment in the games where you do end up playing against a hard lock piece. And this is the conclusion that I feel like I've really come to at the end of this video, is that lock effects should punish decks but not remove them altogether from the metagame. Lock effects like Vanity's Emptiness, which effectively have all reward and no downside as the player playing them, as you can flip up the Vanity's Emptiness on your opponent's turn, effectively disabling any of the downside for you, and then remove it on your turn, allowing you to special summon monsters, means that these type of effects really can't be healthy for your game, as they don't even function as lock for both players. They only function as a lock for your opponent, and effectively can give you a free win when flipped up. A card like Seismitoad EX's Quaking Punch attack definitely leaves your opponent with almost no meaningful options, especially when activated on the earliest turns of the game. Pokemon had to make many rules changes to even allow an attack like Quaking Punch to exist in the game, because if your opponent could activate it on turn 1, it could completely disable you for literally the entire game from playing any item cards. Having no options in a game like that certainly makes it feel like it didn't matter what you had on your side of the board, as if your opponent has the Seismitoad EX, the double colorless energy, and the attack of Quaking Punch right away, there's almost nothing you could ever do to stop them, meaning that the game felt like it was effectively already over before you even got to play. A better example, I think, is a card like Blood Moon. Even though this card can definitely disable many decks and lead to you not having options for play, it has options built into it to circumvent the ability of Blood Moon. Non-basic lands are cards you can simply either run more of in your deck or run more ways to get to in your deck. Not to mention that Blood Moon is also counteracted by playing decks that need mountains in the first place. Having these options built into the card to circumvent it really give your opponents a lot of leeway in terms of how they want to play against a harder lock piece like Blood Moon without having to massively change their deck style. I think a card like Garbodor in Pokemon is the absolute prime example of a way to both punish an ability but not completely disable it, stopping your opponent from being able to play the game altogether. While Garbodor's Trash Avalanche attack only does 20 damage for each item card in your opponent's discard pile, this gives your opponent a really interesting decision every time they were to play an item card. Is it worth it to give Garbodor more attack? Do I need to play this item card to complete my setup? What is the trade-off I want to make? Which makes games much more interesting from both your point of view and the opponent's point of view with a card like Garbodor in your deck. This is a prime example of a lock effect that doesn't fully lock your opponent out of playing the card in the card's card text. And that's the video. Thanks for watching. Feel free to like and subscribe if you want to see more content like this from my channel. It's always free and it helps me out a lot to make more videos more frequently, just like this one. Let me know how you feel about floodgate effects in the comments down below. They're very common in some games like Yu-Gi-Oh! And much rarer in games like Hearthstone, so I think it'd be really interesting to talk about how you guys feel about floodgates depending on which card game you come from. Also, let me know about other floodgate designs in other types of card games. I think there's a lot of room for design in floodgates, and it is much more complicated than just printing a card which disables all of your opponent's abilities to play the game. There's a lot of space here, and I think it is definitely underexplored in most of the card games. Thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you next time.